Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Shortly before midnight on Tuesday, November 5th, the plot line changed. Returns from the swing Midwestern states brought home the shattering fact that an anticipated neck-and-neck presidential race expected to drag on with recounts and challenges for days, weeks, or even months had devolved into a decisive victory for former and future President Donald Trump. The American people had chosen to return to the White House the man who just 4 years earlier had committed the most severe constitutional violation in presidential history, waging an illegal campaign culminating in a violent insurrection attempt to cling to power after losing the election. We awoke, shell-shocked, to a new reality straight out of a dystopian novel with a madman, petty, vain, crude, crass, ugly to his soul, lacking all public spirit, vain and insecure in equal measure, and an inveterate liar, poised to reascend to power and determined to insist on personal loyalty to him as the defining qualification for government service. His victory, moreover, wipes the slate clean and removes virtually any prospect of accountability for the pernicious crimes he committed before, during, and after his previous term as president. There's been a focus since Tuesday on granular causes for Trump's victory and Kamala Harris's loss. For example, Trump's capture of more Latino voters, or Harris's failure to sufficiently distance herself from President Joe Biden. But the overall result was sufficiently decisive and wide-ranging to suggest deeper explanations, particularly in a country that even as they returned him to the presidency, showed no signs of affection for Donald Trump's ideas or personality. And coming to grips with the full weight and implications of this outcome feels essential for constitutional patriots to begin charting a path forward, one that navigates what, for now, feels like an endless wasteland in American political life. To dig below the surface of a stunning turn of events with unpredictable and disquieting consequences for the country and the world, we welcome three of the most experienced and trenchant political analysts out there. And they are Senator Barbara Boxer, a former U.S. Congresswoman and senator from California. She served in Congress from 1983 to 2017. Before that, she served on the Marin County Board of Supervisors and became the first female president of that board. Her memoir, The Art of Tough, Fearlessly Facing Politics and Life, was published in 2016. Thank you, as always, for joining Senator Boxer, especially on such a consequential week.
Thank you.
Norm Ornstein, an emeritus scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a contributing editor for The Atlantic, and co-host of the podcast Words Matter with Kavita Patel. He's also a prolific author and co-wrote the bestseller One Nation After Trump. The new edition may be called One Nation During Trump 2.0, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, and the desperate, and the not yet deported. Doesn't that pack a kind of ironic punch? Norm Ornstein, thanks for being with us.
Always, Harry.
And Jacob Weisberg, executive chair and co-founder of Pushkin Industries. He was previously CEO of the Slate Group, co-founder of Panoply, and editor-in-chief of Slate Magazine. He, too, is the author of several books and serves as chair. Here we go. It's going to be all the more germane and busy for you, of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Jacob Weisberg, thanks very much for joining.
Glad to see you all.
All right, let's start here. We're still waiting on the final tally in the House, but this has the earmarks of a watershed election. Trump wins the popular vote. He likely runs the table on all the swing states. Republicans are in solid command in the Senate. When we think of watershed elections, 1932 or 1968 or 1980, we usually think of the victors as having won a certain war of ideas. And Trump did put forward radical policy ideas that contrasted dramatically with Harris's: mass deportations, tariffs, gutting the civil service. And on Tuesday night, he crowed, "America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate." So the question might seem obvious, but I think it isn't. To what extent would you say his victory represents an embrace by the country of his policy proposals?
I would say the answer to that is hardly at all. First of all, we know that when we ask voters their preferences in terms of policy, they almost uniformly prefer Harris's policy positions, unless for a large number of them you tell them they're coming from Harris. They don't support Trump. The other thing that I found so striking, Harry, is that Sarah Longwell, who's one of the never Trumpers, has done a series of focus groups. And when she asked people, what about the possibility of having an authoritarian? The most common response was, what's an authoritarian? Well, I suspect after a year or so, they won't be asking that question anymore.
It's that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't have much to do with policies unless we think of it as just, I don't like the way things are going. I'm going to blow things up, throw them out because it'll have to be better.
And that's precisely what I mean as the opposite of policy, just a sort of visceral sense of throw the bums out, completely divorced from, for example, mass deportation.
I agree with everything Norm said, but I would take it to this point. I don't think this was about policies. This Trump idea of policy is I've got a concept of a plan. So it wasn't about that. I think it was a rejection of joy and unity and an embrace of anger and disunity. That's awful. People are angry. They have grievance. And, I'm not a shrink. I think that would help me at this moment. And maybe on one of your shows, you might consider having someone like that. But I do think this was not an issues battle. It should have been. It should have been a disqualification when someone says they're going to break up families and have mass deportation. It should have been when someone says they're going to, have these huge tariffs and it's going to spawn inflation, unemployment, all the rest. No, it was about that. And last point I'd make is it had something to do with an unpopular president, an incumbent who I think will go down in history as one of the best. But people just don't feel it. They don't understand that we got out of this terrible pandemic. The rest of the world is jealous of our economy. One of the things I kept telling people to talk about is just the facts. What was the stock market under Trump? What was it under Biden? What was the job creation comparison? You had a president lost Trump. He's the first president since the Great Depression to leave office with fewer jobs than he came in with. And it wasn't COVID, because most of COVID was during Biden. And we had record numbers, 15, 16 million. We just assumed people got all that, but their bad mood got the better of us.
I think I see it somewhat differently. I'm very attuned and concerned about the risk of democratic denial. I think there's certainly a specific cyclical context to the election, what's going on globally, that all incumbents are unpopular and being thrown out in the post-COVID inflation era. And that's all true. But I also think there's a secular phenomenon, which is the increasing separation of the Democrats from parts of their traditional base, working class voters, and particularly minority, Latino, and African American working class voters. And the way that minority working class voters voted much more the way white working class voters are increasingly voted, I think points to a really significant problem for Democrats that goes beyond the specific context of this election. And it's funny, I've been thinking back to the 80s and early 90s. And, after the Democrats lost 3 consecutive presidential elections, it really spurred a fairly deep rethink of policies and messaging and what were the Democrats about. And that's how we got Bill Clinton. And that's how Democrats dominated at the presidential level in the 90s. Democrats have now lost 2 out of 3 elections. And I think it's time for that kind of methodical reassessment of what the party is and what it stands for. And I don't think kind of going back to what we were doing and trying to come up with reasons why this time was an outlier and figuring out how to do what Democrats were doing better, I don't think it's a good answer.
I don't disagree with anything you said. I do think there's an overstatement. If you look at the numbers, we still have our coalition, but he cut into it, and he cut into it. He shouldn't have been able to. There's no question. We still carried Latinos. We still carried Blacks. We still carried women overall. But you're absolutely right. And Bernie Sanders has been saying that we're not fighting for the working people. Well, the bottom line is we do fight for the working people, but we do a lot else also. And I don't think that we have, in fact, told people that. I think one way going forward, I've been doing a lot of thinking and talking to people about this. As soon as Trump starts doing his tax cuts, which are going to go to the billionaires and the millionaires, I think that gives us a golden moment to say, hey, he said he was fighting for you. He's not fighting for you. But we have to have the bills and we have to have the vision to show that, yes, we are for raising the minimum wage. Yes, we are for better working conditions, more and better jobs. I agree. I don't disagree with you, but I don't think it's just one thing or another thing. I think it's all things. And I do think if we step back and realize what actually happened, we had an incumbent president who, in my view, did a great job, but we didn't have good messaging. He had a horrific debate. I adore Joe, and I was not for pushing him out. I watched it, but I couldn't find him. Where did he go in that debate? I could not find him. And after that, in my mind, and I said to the press, I give it 2 weeks. I thought he was coming back, but then there was a whole movement to push him out. And he leaves at the last minute, and the vice president is in a situation that's almost impossible. She ran a flawless and beautiful campaign. But the bottom line is she could separate herself from Joe. And so all of these things, but I don't disagree with you. I think we have to be much more rigorous in reaching out to the people that we lost. I have been saying for years, because I live in this most diverse state in the union, that we're not understanding Latino voters. They are so diverse. Some are super liberal, some are conservative, some are pro-choice, some are anti-choice. Some want to see fairness toward illegals. Others want to be tough. You can't just look at them as a monolith and take it for granted. So yes, as we also go back and look at working people, we have to look back at the Latino community.
I want to just sort of fuse these two in a different way. This was not a rejection of Democrats nearly so much as it was a rejection of the ruling class. It was a much broader sense that all of the experts, all of the people imposing policies on us have screwed it up royally. And that's why, among other things, we saw generals calling Trump a fascist. People didn't believe it. Some of that was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think this populist rejection of elites goes back a long ways. It goes back to the Tea Party, but it's been enhanced. And I would say that COVID mattered more, not just the inflation. That certainly was a trigger across the globe for leaders, right wing and left wing and otherwise. But when I saw Glenn Youngkin get elected in Virginia, what precipitated that? A Republican who turned out to be a Trumpist. And I have to say the sane washing of leaders didn't start with Donald Trump. It started with the Washington Post saying basically because Glenn Youngkin wore a fleece vest that he was really a moderate, but was so clever that he could talk to the people in Southern Virginia differently than he did to those in the Washington suburbs. But what made the difference there is he tapped into the discontent that people felt over the way we handled COVID. It was, all right, you're closing the schools. And frankly, Democrats and health experts basically said, that's the science. That's what we got to do. If you're a family that needs 2 workers to pull in enough income so you can get by, and one of them can't work because your kids have nowhere to go at school or daycare or anywhere else. And if you are a family where that's not the issue, but you're going to have 6 people in a tiny apartment 24/7 for a year or two. And you've got a bunch of elites out there saying, not, geez, this is going to kill us. It's going to kill you. We're so sorry. We got to find some other ways to accommodate, but that's the science. You're going to get an enhanced sense that these people are wrong and let's blow the whole thing up and it won't matter. Now, Barbara, I think you're right about Hispanics. For decades, Democrats just treated it as one big lump of people. But what struck me about this election, I was confident that it would turn out a different way, in part because we had an October surprise. It was Madison Square Garden and the hate fest. And it was multiple ways of going after Puerto Ricans. And we had anecdotal stories of people saying, this brought me back to Trump dissing us with the hurricane and throwing the paper towels. And then we get exit poll results that show that 40-some% of Puerto Ricans voted for Trump. And we know that 60% of Latino men across that board in Michigan voted for Trump. And I think it was either not believing this stuff, and part of that was the sane washing of the press. Yeah, this guy says all kinds of shit, but it won't be any different than the first term. Part of it was, it won't affect me, it'll affect these others. I'm seeing story after story now of Latinos saying, I'm from Guatemala, I'm a citizen, I voted for Trump. My mother is here and she's not legal, but they won't touch her because she's never committed any crime. Well, when they get rounded up, they'll see it a little bit differently. But this sense of let's just blow the whole thing up, which is triggered by inflation, triggered by these other things, but that broader discontent and distrust of everybody running things is something we have to confront more broadly. It's not just Democrats. I think it's all of us. And we have to hope that in the next couple of years, we can get people thinking back that, yeah, they made mistakes, but it's better to have experts than it is to have ignoramuses. It's better to have people who believe in the rule of law than ones who want to blow it up for their own purposes.
Jacob, do you accept Norm's gloss? Because it is consistent with your thesis, I think. You're right that, we used to think of blue-collar workers as in some ways, the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, and I mean the bottom fell out. Do you adopt his way of looking at it, that it's just a kind of visceral distrust of elites born maybe of economic insecurity, whatever you would say about the numbers and the senator would say about Biden's record?
I think that's all true, but I think you have to drill into it a little further. I mean, certainly people are angry and want to blow it up and hate elites, and those are all, as Norm points out, you can trace those phenomena back to the late 1960s. And in some ways, the forms of distrust and anger that have steadily increased, not year by year, but over time. You can chart it on a graph. But I think you have to look at what Trump has done and what Trumpism is. And what Trump did, at least the way I understand it, is first, in 2016, he drove a truck between the Republican Party and its voters. He took over the Republican Party by noticing that a lot of the base of the party, particularly the working class base of the party, did not support Republican interventionist foreign policies. It did not support Republican free trade policies. It did not support Republican moderate pro-immigration policies. And he said, wait a minute, I'm going to take over the party by realigning it with populist views on those issues. In this election, he did a version of the same thing to the Democrats. He saw that there were a lot of Democratic voters that didn't support any of those policies either. So I'm very loath to say this has no policy content. I think it does have policy content. I think Trump's policy understanding is very thin. His policy ideas are very crude and dangerous and impracticable in many cases. But he had a clear message that was a policy message. I think people who voted for him have an idea what he's going to do. They understand their tariffs. They may not like those tariffs when they see them and they bring back inflation and they raise the cost of food and toys and clothes at Walmart. I understand all of that. But they voted for the policy, I think, not just for the person.
So you think that the big coalition is like, tariffs are coming, mass deportations are coming, that's all fine, as opposed to a more of a emotional response of he more represents the upending of things I mistrust. Yeah.
There's always illusioning around Trump. And I think that many people who supported him are going to be very unhappy. And I would, if I had to make a prediction, which I try to avoid doing these days, I would say he's going to be a very unsuccessful president, a very unpopular president in some period of time, maybe 6 months, maybe 3 years, although he is having attacked the Biden economy, which is in fact a very healthy economy. He is going to start immediately taking credit for it. And he's inheriting actually an extremely healthy an economy with historic low unemployment, with inflation totally under control. He's going to blow it up and he's going to leave the problem for the Democrats to clean up once again. This is a pattern which, he just couldn't care less about the deficit. He'll try to get every tax cut through. He won't cut spending and the deficit will get worse. Inflation will come back. I mean, all those seem fairly predictable consequences of his policies. And ultimately, I think they have the potential to make him unpopular, but none of that is going to hit for a while. And he's going to be able to ride the healthy economy for some period of time.
Well, I will say that there's a larger phenomenon here. If you look at what's happened to working people in places like Texas and Florida, run by people almost as radical as Trump, they've been screwed over and over again. In Texas, for example, because Greg Abbott took the state for ideological reasons off the electrical grid, you've had large numbers of people die of heat stroke in the summer, freezing to death in the winter, and they've done nothing about it. We've had these violent storms with people who deny climate, and they're going to hit working people in Florida even harder as the insurers leave, and people with mortgages are going to find out that unless they have insurance, they're going to be foreclosed upon. And they have not blamed the people who have done this. There are some really good books by sociologists about Louisiana, about Wisconsin, about people whose lives have been devastated by right-wing policies, but who still vote for a set of values that is basically taken on these other elites. And that's a secret sauce for Trump. And if you think back to when he ran in 2016, ridiculing the other candidates, it was a populist reaction against Republican Party elites as much as anything that moved him forward. When he could talk about Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and all the others and ridicule them, people resonated to that. They didn't like their own party's elites either. And how long that lasts, I think Jacob is right that it won't take long before those policies hit in a different way. The only question remaining for me is whether we will have elections going forward where we'll see voters be able to express a different point of view.
Well, Norm, that is too horrible to go into today. So I hope and pray that we don't see that. I want to say I agree really with everybody's point of view. This is such an onion that you have to peel back. There's so many things in it.
And a lot of tears.
Yes, that's a very good one. But I'm thinking, as someone who's served in the Senate for a long time, and sometimes in very tough times when we had 45 Democrats, we have to put faces to these bad policies. Norm, all the ones you talked about, the Guatemalan man who said, "Oh, I was fine. It was just grandma," and what are they going to do? I mean, what Trump said before the election is, well, don't worry about it. We'll have family reunification. We'll just deport everybody. The minute that starts to happen, and whatever is related to this, when you say mass deportation, they're words. But when you see a case in point or 5 case in point, so I think it's up to us and up to the leaders to put faces to these policies. For example, a small business who's going to sell T-shirts, and they come in from China and they have 100% tariff. What a mess. We have to have that person. And, women bleeding out, that's an obvious one. It's going to go on. And if he does away with the Department of Education and there's no more Head Start, I want to see the families of those children. So we are facing a time almost like no other, at least in my lifetime. I've lived a very long time, where these policies, if he does follow through on these policies, it's up to us to break through. Because as we've all been saying in our own way, people related to Trump because they share his grievance. And once, he starts taking it out on them and the people they know, this is the moment, and starts rewarding the billionaires, we have to make those points. So it's got to be a new type of populism. And we've got to stop talking in language that people can't follow and start saying, this is what happened to this family going forward.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we pop into the beer aisle for a closer look at the two main types of beers, ales versus lagers. And to help separate lagers from ales, it first comes down to one thing, fermentation. That's the process where the yeast does its magic to give the beer its alcohol content and carbonation. Now, ales are fermented with top fermenting yeast at warm temperatures, somewhere between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas lagers are fermented with bottom fermenting yeast at colder temperatures, between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of their warm fermentations, ales can generally ferment and age in a relatively short period of time, 3 to 5 weeks. Lagers can take longer, up to 6 to 8 weeks. The difference in temperatures and time means this. The quicker fermentation in ales, including stouts, hefeweizens, pale ales, and IPAs, creates a fruitier, spicier flavor that's crisp and refreshing. At Total Wine and More, we have over 1,100 ales, so you can explore all you want. Lagers, including Helles, Pilsners, have a smoother, richer, more mellow and robust flavor than ales, thanks to their longer fermentation time. We can thank the Bavarian brewers from the Middle Ages for discovering the benefits of longer fermentation after storing their brews in ice caves during the winter. In fact, Lager in German means to store, which adds up since lager beer was brewed, covered, and stored with ice harvested from nearby lakes. At Total Wine and More, we have an ice cave of our own filled with a huge selection of ales and lagers from around the world. Just remember the next time you enjoy one, give a little cheers to fermentation.
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. We'll double back some on the what is to be done. I want to stick a little bit with the campaign, though really it's by way of analyzing more deeply, as Jacob says, where we are. I mean, we're a lot smarter than last week when two of you said you were expecting Harris to win, notwithstanding everything, and there are different reasons. But sitting here today, do you think the election was won or lost during the campaign? Is there anything Harris could have done differently that would have changed the outcome as you see it now?
Well, maybe I'll take a whack at that. I think she ran the campaign in a way of a front runner. I think she played it too safe. I think she did make fairly few mistakes, and she was, very impressive in a lot of ways. But boy, I wish she'd gone on the Joe Rogan show. I don't know why she didn't. That was, a great opportunity. It wouldn't have been tough on her. That was a great opportunity to reach out, particularly to young men. I think hers was a fairly vacuous campaign. She just couldn't answer fundamental questions about her past positions or even many of her current positions. Now, in fairness to her, she was in an impossible position because she couldn't repudiate Biden and she couldn't identify herself with Biden. So in a way, she had to kind of tap dance and suggest that she was going to turn a page and it was all going to be different, but without attacking the policies that she'd had a role in promulgating, and also in many cases were good policies that were being attacked for the wrong reason or unfairly. I think she was in that position because Biden ran again, which he shouldn't have done, and because he wasn't challenged in a primary, which he should have been, because I think Democrats are a little superstitious about the idea that if you're challenged in a primary, your party loses. I don't think that's a given. And then lastly, because he handed it over to her so late and without a process that either tested her or allowed her to differentiate herself among a field, even if it would have been some kind of extraordinary event, I just think the die was cast by that series of mistakes.
I don't know that if she had gone on the Joe Rogan. I mean, I also felt that way. I wanted her to go on. But had she gone on, he still would have supported Trump the next day. And, so I don't think that was a pivotal moment. But I do share your wish that she had gone on because she's very good. And she could have simply said, look, I've evolved because I'm much more pragmatic than I was. And she knew how to handle it. She was a good candidate. And by the way, I remember when she was not a good candidate, which was when she ran for president, and I endorsed Joe Biden at that time. I didn't think she was good. But when she was thrust into this, she really stepped up. And there's nothing I could do except to say this. And I'm as much to blame as anybody else because I thought she ran a great campaign. She was going to win. So I'm now doing something after I see that she lost. So here's what I think. The message of joy and togetherness and unity, and we can do this, and was so off as far as where the people were. So is that her fault? No, it's somebody's fault. You're supposed to find out who the heck thinks that that's where people are. It's certainly where I tend to be. I'm always looking for the bright side and the joy and the unity and the love of diversity and the love of respecting everyone in every way. It talked to me. It got me so excited. And the people I know, well, obviously, that's not enough to win an election. So what I'm trying to say is he had the darkest of the darkest messages. He even changed his red hat to the colors of the Proud Boys or whatever. And, Hitler did good things and all this stuff was so dark. Did I ever think the people were that dark? Guess what? The people are that dark. So there was a fundamental issue. I'm not blaming anybody. I don't think they knew exactly the mood of the country, or in their polls, they didn't elicit that. I mean, I would love Norm to expound on that because it's like a flawless campaign if you had a certain type of electorate where that was the message they were waiting for. Oh, no, that was not the message they were waiting for. So I wonder, Norm, what you think happened in the campaign. Is this what they thought the winning message was?
It is, and it was based on their own research. And, most of us who looked at all the numbers and looked more deeply were still very surprised by this. I don't really blame Harris, and I don't blame Biden. We can point fingers in all those ways. I actually think, Jacob, that if Biden had said a year or two ago, I'm a transitional president, I'm not going to run again, one, he would have been a lame duck, and the policies that he was able to implement would not have been probably as effective, or he wouldn't have accomplished as much. Two, we would have had 15 candidates out there. Every wannabe thinking this is the train, and if I don't get on this one, there may not be another one for a very long time. And if at the end of it, the Democratic Party had nominated a white guy by rejecting the heir apparent, a woman of color, knowing that to win, the first thing they had to do was get an excited and mobilized base. And she did a better job of that by far than Biden would have done had he been able to stay in that base. I'm not sure that we would have had anything different or seen a better outcome. The Democrats had, under Harris, with Jen O'Malley Dillon, the best turnout operation by far I have ever seen. They had the resources to do it. They had the people on the ground. But you're not going to motivate people to vote if they don't want to vote. And it's true that it was a problem at the margins. And I'm not sure what other message she could have had, Barbara. She couldn't double down on a divisive campaign to try and match Trump. And I think there was an expectation that Trump had, and I'll say the expectation I had was Trump had a floor of 45%. 45% who, if he took an AR-15 and mowed down all of Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, would still be with him. I thought he had a ceiling of 47 or 48%, and that you could leverage enough more support in the states that mattered and get that turnout just by noting the contrast between the two, but seeing what Trump was saying and what he was doing. You could see the mental deterioration out on the trail, the viciousness of what he had done, the fact that he incited January 6th. If I'm going to point some fingers here, I could point a finger at Merrick Garland, because I believe that if in the aftermath of January 6th, in the aftermath of the Senate under Mitch McConnell refusing to convict him, and then Mitch McConnell saying right at that point, this is not the appropriate venue. The criminal justice system is the appropriate venue. If Merrick Garland right after that had said, he's right, I'm appointing an independent counsel, I think we might have seen a trial, and we might have had maybe more people at least saying, oh, this guy wanted to overturn the election. But even with that, I think we've just had this broader phenomenon. I'll come back to it. It started long before Trump. The transformation of the Republican Party into a radical cult started long before Trump.
You're thinking 94, Norm? What are you thinking?
Well, I'm actually thinking, if we want to go back, it was 1979 when Newt Gingrich began the process of tribalizing the country. Then it was 2009, then coming in 1994, but 2009 with the advent of the Tea Party movement, which frankly was less of an economic discontent and more of the darker social side, but it was again a rejection of elites. And this has been building for a long time, and then COVID took it to another level. I don't think we could say one thing or two things or things that Harris might have done. I would have loved for her to have gotten a little more distance from Biden by saying how she would have dealt with things differently. I think she could have handled the border issue in a much better way. I think she could have gotten some distance from what happened in Afghanistan. Would that have made the difference here? And, when you get a New Jersey that goes for Harris by 4%, when you have a Minnesota that's actually a little bit in question when you have the governor on the ticket, it tells you that this is something bigger than what kind of a campaign the candidate ran. And we're going to have to grapple with that. I mean, the Democratic Party needs some, obviously, self-analysis and has to find ways to do better. But I would say we also have to find ways to deal with a Trump administration and a Republican Congress with some of the same effectiveness and using the same tactics, maybe not to the same extreme, as Republicans did to discredit the Biden administration, as they had done before to discredit the Obama administration. Democrats have to change the way they look at the world and change the way they look at politics and bring a gun to a gunfight.
When you say gun to a gunfight, there is this problem of there's just a bunch of lying by all that. And that's an honest problem for democracy. How do you sort of fight back against blatant lies? But I wanted to ask you, Jacob, Norm mentioned the splendid ground game and get out the vote of Harris. And I think that was part of what buoyed Harris supporters in the last few days. Now, you had some involvement, yes, but it seemed like this very conventional wisdom, you just got to knock on door after door. They just blew them away, did the Democrats. They had a great ground game, and the Republicans had a crappy one, it seems, and that didn't matter. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I was part of the Get Out the Vote effort in Pennsylvania for 4 days through Election Day. I'm a journalist by trade, and so I've never done that before, but I'm not writing for any news organization at the moment. So I felt strongly enough about it. I thought I want to do something. Partly I thought if she loses, I don't want to feel like I was just watching from the sidelines and criticizing. And what I saw was really interesting. One, exactly as you say, there was tremendous enthusiasm and huge thousands of people coming in on buses. And when you went door to door, as I did in South Philly, in the Philadelphia suburbs, out in the rural area to the west of Philadelphia, you saw no sign of any get out the vote effort from Donald Trump. I did see there were some signs that David McCormick, the Republican Senate candidate, who seems likely to have won that seat, did have. You saw his flyers on doorsteps. We knocked on doors. I and my daughter and a friend of ours knocked on 600 doors in 4 days. And people said, you're the fifth person who has been by here in 5 days. And most of them were really happy to see us, although it was interesting. There were a lot of people who whispered and said, we don't want our neighbors to know, and look at the Trump sign over there, and we're not speaking to them anymore. Or the wife would answer the door and say, thank God my husband's not home. I can tell you I'm for you. Or the husband would answer the door and say, get out of here. I don't want you talking to my wife. I mean, literally, we saw things like that. But it all felt like, boy, we're here. They're not. That can't be good for them. I don't think it mattered one bit. And I just think in other kinds of elections, getting out the vote, I think still obviously matters. But there was nobody who didn't get the message that it was important to vote this time. I think the media saturation was total. The community saturation was total. And the problem was not that Harris didn't turn out her vote. It was that there wasn't enough vote for her to turn out. At least that was my kind of anecdotal analysis of it. So it was very disheartening in that respect. But I guess what the result says to me is it's time for really kind of deeper introspection. And all the things that we've been saying about Trump, that I've been writing about Trump, about authoritarianism, about disrespect for democracy, about his criminal record, about his trying to overthrow the government, reverse the result of the last election, disrespect for norms and the rule of law, all true. I say disrespect for norms and disrespect for Norm, who's here with us.
Lawyer up.
But it's all true, and it's not resonating. It's not resonating. People have heard it, and the people who care, and I don't think it's going to persuade incremental voters, certainly not at this point. Democrats have to figure out how to make a different kind of substantive appeal, I think, on issues. Assume the Republican Party is going to be the Trumpy Republican Party with or without Trump in the future, and figure out how to formulate a series of positions and ways to express those positions that resonate with middle class and working class voters better than their message did this time.
I wanted to mention something. I heard Eric Swalwell, who I think is a very good communicator, and he said something really interesting, very different, actually. He said, instead of leaning into issues, he said, we have to have candidates who lean into their personalities, who are authentic. And he underscored something also that the newly elected senator from New Jersey said. People really don't like politicians. And you have to just go. He said he did a listening tour, and 9 out of 10 people said, I just don't want a politician. And sometimes I think the people went to Trump because he's an entertainer. I mean, I hate to go down this lane because I'm a policy person as Barbara Streisand once said in a movie, I'm an issues person, and I am an issues person. And Eric was saying that our candidate in Arizona, Gallegos, he said he just went to the rodeos. He went all over, and in a very harsh election, difficult, looks like he's going to make it. So I think that whole thing, it's a little disheartening for me because, we're talking about reaching out to the voters, but it's almost who's delivering the message. If they appear like a politician nowadays, now I don't know how long that lasts. And Norm said, well, maybe people will eventually realize you need someone with that expertise. It's maybe we're getting to a place for president where the personality, the way they talk about things are important. Last thing I want to ask all of you guys about is this. Am I wrong? But I read somewhere that no one has ever been reelected president for a second term, or they didn't even run if they had an approval rating of 40%. And so Biden's been about 40%. And when Norm said, I wish she might have detached a little bit more from Joe, was that a warning sign? Because even all the good he did, and I love him so dearly, and I think he will go down as an extremely consequential president, great president, what he did. But with 40%, and she kept saying, let's turn the page, she meant let's turn the page on Trump. But every time she said, let's turn the page, I looked at my husband, Stu, and I said, oh my goodness, she better clarify that. So I wonder just if we could talk a minute about that incumbency issue and Norm's point that, I wish she could have moved away. In her heart, she didn't want to do that because she loves him. So it was almost like so difficult. I'd love to hear what you guys think about it.
First, presidential approval rating has an extremely high correlation with election, both for re-election for a president and for the party. That matters. I will say that in a broader sense, and this gets back to where Jacob started, Democrats have this tendency to believe that actions speak for themselves.
Yeah.
And so I go back to Build Back Better. What does it mean? It's an absolutely meaningless slogan. But when they started with Build Back Better, it turned the discussion over that sweeping set of policies that did things for the working class and the middle class that were all wildly popular across the board. But it turned it into, will it be 3.7 trillion? Will it be 2.4 trillion? And then in the end, it looked like a loss, but nobody knew what the hell it was. If Joe Biden had gone out to the suburbs of Cleveland or Pittsburgh and said, we're going to give you subsidies for childcare because that's the best jobs program we can do, then you can have a spouse who can go to work and not have to put everything that he or she earns back into the childcare. If they had talked about free community college and what it would mean for your kids being able to get a leg up in the next job market, and done it by focusing on the policies instead of the slogans, it would have made a difference. I would just for a second to go back when Obama did his American Rescue and Recovery Act, and it was called the American Rescue and Recovery Act. My wife and I went to a national park in the West a year or so later, and we're driving through, and everywhere we went, there was a sign. This studio was made possible by grants from the American Recovery and Rescue Act, this roadway and all of that. And I turned to my wife and I said, how many people in this park do you think know that that was Obama's stimulus package? And she said 2. And it would have been only 1 if you hadn't told me. We had this stimulus that Congress passed under Trump that he opposed. But when they got it through, he made sure he signed the checks going out to people. So they thought it came from him. We saw all these instances of Republicans in Congress taking credit for infrastructure programs that they had voted against. And Democrats, it's not just talking better, but it's finding ways to communicate with those voters that they've lost when they're doing policies that they approve of and they don't have any idea about those policies. That's a part of it. In this era of discontent that I do believe was just dramatically accelerated by the upheaval in the society and people's lives from COVID, that Trump precipitated, but people didn't blame him for it, that this backlash against elites and backlash against politicians. I did a Zoom with Dan Osborne, who ran as an independent for this in Nebraska, and came across as a more polished version of John Fetterman. But he was not a politician, never run before. And he came damn close to beating Fisher, who, was not a great candidate, but in a very Republican state, because he came across as one of them, as a working person. I thought the choice of Tim Walz, people saying, oh, if only she'd pick Shapiro. Well, maybe it made a difference at one point. Pennsylvania would have lost everywhere else, because good as Josh Shapiro is, he comes across as a politician, and Tim Walz doesn't. But that wasn't enough, given this tide of discontent and anger.
Yeah. I mean, Democrats, I think, just at this point in our political history, feel a greater sense of responsibility, and they're not willing to be shameless in the way that Republicans are. It was a very difficult position for Biden that Harris inherited, where they essentially had to think that voters, a lot of the public was just wrong about their perception of what they had done and of the economy. They believed that they had pursued these policies that had worked, that had supported a soft landing for the economy, and that had us in a kind of fundamentally healthy place. Voters didn't think that, but you can't tell voters that they misunderstand their own reality. That gap is very hard to bridge. I think the way around it is both a substantive message and the person to deliver it. I mean, I go back to Bill Clinton. What could Bill Clinton do? Bill Clinton, as a politician, could relate to ordinary people better than, almost anybody I've ever seen. Any room he was in, he walked out of it and people thought, that guy gets me and I get that guy. Second of all, he was a master of policy. He understood, like you, Senator Boxer, he dug into this stuff and would talk about it until everybody was, blue in the face or dead asleep, because he really loved it and was really interested. And thirdly, he moved the party to the center. He was able to claim back voters who had been moving, who had voted for Reagan, who had moved to the Republican camp. And I think that basic formula is, what I would look to. Who is the person to deliver that message? I'm not sure. I think it's a talented bench in the Democratic Party. I think there are a lot of moderate governors who are successful, popular, understand policy, relate to people, are appealing, can bridge divides. I don't think the Democrats lack the talent, but there has to be a process where they figure this out. And I would say it starts with really acknowledging and recognizing what hasn't worked.
You're certainly right, Jacob. And now, Gretchen Whitmer and Josh Shapiro look as if they maybe played the hand well. But I've seen caricatured by the other guys a fair bit the Democratic campaign as having been about, the silly issues on the extreme left. The Tim Walz wanted transgender bathroom, et cetera. We got to remember that the Democrats knew this. She led relentlessly, middle class. The things we're saying didn't go through, but at least they knew it at the time. They didn't make the mistakes that some people are ascribing to them. I want to serve a sort of general question up, though. We've said already in this episode, a lot of how should they be responding and what should. So David Brooks today says, we got to start today to respond, remake the party to win back many of the working class voters who went to Trump, etc. Norm, you've written, we have to find ways to restore public trust and responsible governing and expertise, which is a different and very important point, don't get me wrong. But I just want to serve up the position of Jen Rubin as representative and see what you think. The very contrary position is the idea we have to understand how or why Trump won to prepare to fight him is a category error. It is 1933. Hitler is in power. No time for a fucking seminar on Democrats' messaging errors. It's just trench warfare and trying, that's where lovers of the Constitution and the rule of law need to be now, rather than trying to sort of temporize, do him one better at his own game, etc. Thoughts?
Well, let me jump in because already we've had Gavin Newsom, our governor here in California, call a special session. Our Attorney General, Rob Bonta, has stated, we are here. We are not sitting back. We are making sure we have the money to take them to court like we did 100 times. They did it 100 times when he was there the last time. And we're not going to let you take away workers' rights and LGBTQ rights and women's rights. And you're not going to foil our plans to clean our air and clean our water, safe drinking water, and all of that. And I also saw J.D. Pritzker get up and say, you're going to come after my people, you come through me. I mean, there is this bench of, and there are many others that are doing it as well. Kathy Hochul did it as well in New York. So I do think there's this group of strong governors who are looking at this from a states' rights perspective. But I'm going to just speak as someone who served a long time in Congress. It's going to be rough going if they take the House, the Republicans, which they may. And if that's a trifecta, Jennifer Rubin is right. You can't sit around and wait to lose every protection that we have in the Constitution. But they've got the Supremes, they've got the whole thing. So I think that the voices that have to be heard at the Senate, voices like Adam Schiff, he's on the enemies list. So I'm thinking, Trump took the whole thing. Maybe he's now going to turn away from all that anger and just bask in the glow. What do you think?
So I see Joe Rogan saying, now is the opportunity. He can become the uniter. He is a narcissistic sociopath with some serious mental deterioration. The first thing he said after getting elected was promises made, promises will be kept. We know what the promises are. It may not be 1933 and he may not be Hitler, but he is probably a worse version of Orban. And where I disagree with Jen is if you don't understand what happened and why, the ability to come up with whatever tactics you can that will counter this will, be lost. And I would just say a couple of things that we need to do now. Joe Biden needs to be a different Joe Biden for the remaining 70 plus days of his term. He has immunity given by the Supreme Court. I want him to send every weapon possible to Ukraine and as much money as he can. And if that means pushing the envelope of the law and maybe beyond it, once they're there, they're not coming back. And I want to see every single judgeship that can be filled, whether it's blue slipped by Republicans or not, a Senate that's in session constantly from this point on. That, by the way, is what Republicans did when Biden won the presidency. And I want to see strategy sessions. The filibuster is going to be used by Democrats now. That's the big weapon that remains legislatively. We know that Trump, if he can't get it done in the legislature, in the Congress, is just going to do executive actions, even if they're completely illegal. We need to amass an army of lawyers who will go to courts. I want a bunch of counter Matthew Kaczmaryks, judges like the one in Amarillo, Texas, who issue nationwide injunctions to block some of these actions. They will go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court may ultimately allow them, but to make it clear where they are violating every law and norm along the way. We need to get a different communications network to counter the misinformation and disinformation that they're going to do when bad policies blow up on them. They're going to find ways to lie about it. And we can't trust the Washington Post or the normal communications networks to do that. There has to be an all hands on deck. On that basis, Jen is absolutely right. And the threat is palpable and real.
I'm as worried as Norm is about Trump's authoritarian tendencies, but I think those outcomes are a possibility, very dangerous possibility, but not necessarily a probability and certainly not a certainty. And I think we really have to avoid hyperbole, crying wolf, hysteria for both substantive and political reasons. I really think Jen Rubin is making a mistake comparing Trump to Hitler and saying it's 1933. It's not, and he's not. Hitler and Mussolini and other fascist leaders had an ideology that they were absolutely committed to and that they worked through the system. Trump is a very different animal. He's an opportunist. He's a narcissist. He's someone who loves attention. He does not have a set of radical beliefs that he has held on to over a period of time. He is an opportunist. It's very different. And I think that the tendency is extremely dangerous. But I just think the hyperbole's gotten us nowhere. And I think continuing it will be really counterproductive. You have to wait and respond in a very substantive way to what he does. And absolutely, you have to fight against any way in which he violates the Constitution, challenges norms. It will happen. It will happen in certain ways, but not in the way that we're never going to have another election. Is that possible? It's possible he'll try. I think it's very unlikely.
All right, the lines are drawn and the stakes, it's clear, are very, very high and elementary. And this is just the conversation I wanted to have, digging much deeper beyond just the surface demographics and the like. Thank you very much, Senator Boxer, Jacob, Norm, and a lot to talk about and a sad expanse of time to talk about it in. Thank you so much to Senator Boxer, Norm, and Jacob. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is and remains a completely independent production, uniquely, I think, among the leading law and politics podcasts. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, or maybe don't worry too much. As long as you need answers, the feds will keep Talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producers Gabriella Glick and Becca Havian, sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahendranathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistants by Akshaj Turbailu, Genesis Magpayo, and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.